Just a quick reminder while Courtney's getting ready to ask the question that remember, we do not have lab on Friday. So enjoy your day off. Make sure you guys are still doing that critical power lab on your own so we can go ahead and talk our way through it. We'll take it forward in the future. No worries. So effectively, aerobic training will interfere with progress you will make from strength training. However, strength training will not interfere with progress you will make from aerobic training. So now some folks become so afraid of this interference effect that they don't do any cardio because it'll hurt their gains. But in reality, the research where people are doing both strength training and aerobic training, they might only make 70 to 80% of the same progress they would have made if they would have done the strength training alone, but they're still making a lot more progress than they didn't train at all. And like anything else, depending on development, what level of fitness you're going into it with, you're going to need to do a certain amount of aerobic training just so that you're going to be able to perform at your sport. So it's not going to be that bad. The key is how much cardio you're doing. Obviously, it's the dose that makes the poison. So if you're just doing cardiovascular work once or twice a week, it might actually help improve your progress you're making in the gym, so to speak, because you'll recover potentially faster because you've got a better aerobic base. When you get to like really crazy ends of the spectrum of just massive land mammals that are trying to lift insane loads, that's the type of situation where you're definitely probably gonna need to cut back just because you're doing so much work that doing anything on top of it is gonna make it really hard to recover and more likely to mess up your athlete than really help them. So yeah, don't be afraid to do some cardiovascular work. The key is when you're doing so much that it's affecting your aerobic performance and your recovery, that's where it's time to bring it back some. So anytime, that was a good question, Courtney. Now, we're obviously talking about carbs when we left off, how glycogen is pretty important, and we want to make sure that we're getting enough in. Some athletes, when they're doing insanely high volumes of training, they might actually not really be hungry enough to actually replace what they're burning. So what that means effectively is they can be doing literally so much work that they effectively, for lack of a better term, you can think of it almost like they forget to eat. They're like, their normal hunger signals aren't as great. And now this is when we're talking about massive volumes of work. Most everyone is going to eat in accordance to their physical activity level, except for sedentary individuals. Those folks will actually eat far beyond their normal satiety signals, which is part of the reason why exercise is a big component for just overall health and weight management, along with obviously folks that are doing insane levels of exercise. They might actually be that hungry at all because it turns out they're putting their body into a more stressful state. Okay. So glycemic index effectively is how rapidly our body is going to bring that carbohydrate into the bloodstream. So how quickly we're gonna have that blood sugar spike, which is useful for trying to replenish glycogen quickly, or we're trying to really get our blood sugar up. So hence that's gonna be good during workouts and after workouts. However, the rest of the time, we typically wanna be living in the moderate to low GI. So this is gonna be foods that are gonna take a little bit longer to break down as far as getting those carbs into the system. Notice you see a lot of mixed foods. The simpler the sugar, the higher the GI, the more complex the sugar, the lower GI. But if we're taking in a diet or a meal that has got fiber and fat in it, that's going to naturally slow your carbohydrate uptake. So like anything else, when we're taking in one food with another, glycemic index is not a perfect indices, but it's just something to be aware of, folks, specifically when we're talking about rapidly getting ourselves to replenish glycogen, which really is something you want to start on effectively immediately at the end of any legitimate aerobic style workout you're doing, and even some strength and conditioning or strength workouts if you're doing a big enough amount of volume. So now, obviously, things that are carbohydrate is going to be important whenever it comes to how long we're going to last. We have over here is how quickly we're going to deplete our muscle glycogen levels given different exercise intensities. So it's super low intensity. As you can see, after 3 hours, yeah, we've got a pretty significant depletion, but at over 64 or 64% of our max, look at that. It's only 2 hours, 83% of our max. So we could be talking about playing something like soccer. We can have an athlete that's quite possibly ending that game with empty glycogen stores. And then if we're doing insanely high efforts, now we can talk about depleting it even faster. And obviously the glycogen levels will be really important for the athlete. Now, timing is also important. If we try to do carbohydrates effectively in the 1 hour to 30 minutes before exercise, well, we're going to have this blood sugar response because we're digesting it and now our body's releasing insulin. So when we start exercising on top, we're going to crash our blood sugar and we're actually going to cause exhaustion. Notice to set in faster than it would otherwise. So in the example where people just didn't have any calories, they actually lasted longer doing the same endurance event, which this really means for you guys. We want to make sure that we're taking in a little bit of carbohydrates right as we're getting warmed up and getting going, and or having that last real meal about 2 hours before our workout. And then we can obviously have carbohydrates while we're working out, as long as it's going to be tolerated. So like anything else, if we're taking in while we're exercising, it's not going to really give us any issues other than we might cramp up because we're taking too much. Now, we are going to be increasing what's known as our GLUT4 receptor sensitivity. So our muscles are going to be actually better at taking up carbs. And so we are not really going to need to use insulin as much because our body's naturally trying to take it in. Now, if you take in that carbohydrate immediately as soon as you get done with exercise, congratulations, you're going to go ahead and be synthesizing glycogen at a faster rate, as opposed to if you wait about 2 hours. Now, anyone that talks about how you wasted your workout because you failed to do the post-workout window for supplementation is wrong. The key is you might not be benefiting. You're benefiting a little bit less, or you're not recovering as fast, which when you do that over years and years of training, yes, that's going to be a bigger effect. But in the acute sense, don't let those fears effectively get in the way of just getting out there and training. Taking in carbohydrates plus protein post-workout is not just going to help us repair our muscles, but also replenish our glycogen levels. So don't be afraid to do both at the same time. Now, fat is a great energy source. It's incredibly dense. We pretty much want to avoid trans fats as an end-all be-all. Saturated fats, some are better than others. It's the problem is when you use things in buckets as opposed to we want to break it down by individual fatty acids, but that's something we're going to get into far more in bioenergetics. Now, it's important when it comes to a number of different vitamins, and then obviously our cholesterol-based hormones or steroid hormones, and then obviously being what our cell membranes are made up of, along with it's a big component of our nerve fibers. So we want to have a certain amount of fat in the diet. Low-fat diets can be useful for some folks to lose weight. The problem with it is satiety, meaning you're not feeling as full from effectively eating a low-fat diet as you would from eating a normal fat diet. And at the same time, like anything else, we want to make sure that we're allowing all of our tissues to recover. So fat is something you're always going to need just because you can pick. Oh, sorry, I'm just sitting in a room talking to myself, which is very uncomfortable and unnerving. So what would you like me to go through again? No worries. Are there any other questions I can work on for you guys while we're hanging out? That is a great question and a really hard one to answer. You figure for baseline, just kind of overall neurological functioning and not feeling like crap, you figure you're probably looking at a minimum of about 70 grams of carbohydrate a day for your average adult. Your liver through gluconeogenesis can make the rest of what you need. Now, obviously, as we go up from there, it depends on your demands from your sports. So, are you working out and specifically doing things at a high enough intensity that you're utilizing effectively aerobic and anaerobic? Oh yeah, no, I figured that out. That's okay. If you're using aerobic or anaerobic glycolysis and we're really burning through a lot of carbs, we want to make sure to replace it. Lactating women arguably have an even higher demand for carbohydrate, usually about another 50 on top of that initial 70. And this is like bottom of the floor type situations. You obviously can go all the way down to 0, where you can have effectively no carbohydrate each day, and that's going to be a ketogenic diet. And there's nothing wrong with doing that if that happens to be what works for you. The key is, like anything else, we want to have a good relationship with food, with our body, and with our overall health and well-being. So there isn't really so much you need to have this many grams of carbohydrate. It always comes down to, it depends. And I don't like dealing with averages because it works for your average person. So yeah, figure 70 grams minimum per day. But instead, most folks should probably start off with just looking at total calorie intake. Are they getting in enough? And then from there, actually looking at, make sure they're getting enough of the fat sources we're looking at. Specifically, we talked about for the importance of the nervous system, hormonal system, and just cell membranes. And that's where, when you talk about things like omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acid, it seems to be pretty important. And then getting enough protein for whatever your goals are. And then you can fill in the rest with effectively more carbs, fats, or protein based upon personal preferences. Where do you feel the best dietarily, metabolically, performance-wise, and go from there. So if you want to just kind of a quick and dirty, like a true average, I would say to go just start off at about probably 200 grams of carbohydrate in a day. An easy way to do it mathematically would be effectively figure out how much you weigh in pounds, and then you could pretty much just multiply that by 1.5. If you're a relatively sedentary person, you do get up, you walk around, but you're not really working out for anything really too hard. And that's where the previous examples, if we go back even further, we've got examples of literally individuals that are taking in literally 13 grams per kilogram body mass. That's different than pound, each day to keep up the work outputs. So when we're exercising, we're going to use fats as a fuel source. And remember, that's important because it's going to help spare our glycogen. Now, we can't break down the true triglycerides as themselves. They have to be broken down into individual free fatty acids and a glycerol. Now, in general, if you happen to take in a higher fat diet, you do have a greater availability of free fatty acids. However, you typically have a lower carbohydrate glycogen store. So there's not really compelling evidence to tell you that you should try a high fat diet for aerobic performance. But this is really talking about peak performance. If your goal is just to, feel good and enjoy life, if you enjoy naturally a more high fat diet, go for it. Who cares? If your goal is to try to be the best 5K athlete, mile run, anything where we're talking about really going hard in glycolytic systems, then that's where we're definitely going to need to make sure we're taking in enough carbohydrate to support that. So then we have protein, where we have our essential and non-essential amino acids. Proteins are important for pretty much, it's what our body's pretty much made out of, outside of the fats for the phospholipid bilayer of our membranes. Carbohydrates, obviously ribose is incorporated into RNA and DNA, but it's one of those things that's going to be very important for overall health and performance. No worries. You can go whatever rate you guys want to. I'm just happy someone is talking with me today. Otherwise, whew, it's very quiet in here. Not the biggest fan. Why do you ask? Oh, whenever those videos were shot, I was probably about 214. Right now, I'm probably usually about 210, give or take a little bit. Yeah. Good. Any questions in general on nutrition? I mean, a lot of you guys are going to be taking bioenergetics if you're not already doing so, but we can go ahead and touch on some of those concepts right now. All right. So once again, protein is going to be the thing that's really making every single structure, every single enzyme in your body for the most part. I mean, obviously, protein, collagen, otherwise important when it comes to connective tissue. It's going to be important for effectively the cellular processes that are going to allow us to lay down new bone mass. And this protein consumption level right here, this is what we're looking at for Homer Simpson. Just the bare minimum to keep somebody alive per day, which is 0.8 grams per kilogram of body mass. Now, if you enjoy being a long distance athlete and want to perform well, you're probably talking about more in the neck of 1.2 to 1.5 grams per day. And if your goal is to be a strength power athlete, now we're talking about kicking that up to about 1.5 to 1.8 grams per kilogram of body mass per day. And then when we're talking about a strength power athlete that's trying to maintain or really avoid losing lean mass while on a diet, now we're talking about 2.5 grams of protein per kilogram of body mass per day. So there is nothing wrong with taking in greater amounts of protein like anything else. We're taking this in with carbohydrates after workout is going to allow you to recover faster. And, you can potentially use protein as a fuel source when you happen to be exercising, but at the same time, you're really doing damage to your muscle cells and your tendons, and that's going to require obviously protein for the repair. So hence the higher requirements if we're an aerobic athlete, if we're a strength athlete. Now, we then have vitamins. Now, these are small essential organic molecules, meaning carbon is going to be the base for this. This is really important for a number of different enzymatic processes in the body, along with even helping us really create energy is where most of our B vitamins are important. Vitamin C is important in collagen synthesis. Vitamin A is important in literally our visual system. Vitamin E is a major antioxidant. It's okay. It's okay. Vitamin D is pretty much a hormone. It functions really as a hormone. It's important for bone mineral density and then also for even things like muscle function. And then we've got vitamin K, which is important in blood clotting, decalcifying our arteries, and helping us avoid taking the long dirt nap at too early of an age. So, great question on what's my thoughts on a vegan diet for an athlete. Well, There's a number of reasons why anyone would choose to be vegan. If you're specifically talking about it's an ethical decision, it's a personal palate choice, it's something that you obviously enjoy eating, um, then that's fine. I can completely respect the ethical decision for anybody to be a vegan, meaning, they're not comfortable with the idea of the mass incarceration of a large number of animals to be raised simply for murder in very, very horrible situations. Um, I'm not really joking when I say this, in that whether we ever, an alien species ever comes to the planet and enslaves humanity, I hope and or we create an artificial intelligence that does the same thing. I hope they treat us the same way we treat house cats. Or cats have a pretty good life. They let them kind of do their thing. They do neuter and spay a lot of them, so not really sign up for that one. But it's better than dogs, where there's a lot more eugenics going on with dogs, where they breed them to keep the bloodlines pure, and that's really weird to me. But then think about what humans do to chickens, what we do to cows. How Imagine the type of war we'd start with another country that we found out that they were getting women pregnant, taking their kids, the male ones they were immediately castrating, and the females they were taking off and then essentially using the women for their milk production for years upon years until eventually they dried out and then slaughtering them for low quality meat. That's pretty much how how dairy production goes. Obviously, there's some changes, and it's not all perfectly like that. You can look at factory farming and chicken. Either way, getting back to your original conversation on the vegan thing, it does make certain things more difficult. It can be harder to get in a higher protein diet. It can be harder to get some vitamins and minerals, mostly potentially some issues with iron, potentially. But any diet can effectively work for an individual as long as we're being deliberate, maybe having to use some supplementation. But yes, you can definitely be a vegan. Now, if you're doing a vegan diet to say you're being healthier or you like to be pretentious, that's not going to be really that accurate. Um, as in, when you're talking about being a vegan, and then we can have a really interesting long conversation about, crop production in the world, along with you can obviously do some low quality, unhealthy versions of a vegan diet. It's not that hard to do a bad job of any diet. But I think, like anything else, if that's something that you're interested in, immediately watching your iron levels, B12 could be another potential issue. Also possibly some other vitamin and mineral issues, depending on, like, once again, your approach. So it's just being mindful of looking at, okay, am I getting enough of my electrolytes? Am I getting enough of my major, macro and micro minerals, my vitamins? Carbohydrates can be really easy to do. Fats can be tricky in some cases, but highly unlikely as long as you have access to a lot of different types of sources. Yeah, if I had the money for it, I would do algae-based fish oil. We're talking about omega-3, just because it's the base of the food pyramid, has the least amount of potential for heavy metals, and yeah, algae don't have nervous systems, though nothing on the planet really wants to get killed and eaten. But that seems to be the more ethical choice there. Um, yes. So does that answer your question there, Abby? Okay. Yeah. If you want to know more, we can always talk about this in person. It doesn't bother me. So vitamins, obviously I gave you guys a list. We're talking about water soluble and fat soluble. Fat soluble is your A, D, E, and K. Water soluble is your B vitamins and vitamin C. And like anything else, we don't want to go necessarily too high. It's pretty hard to go into toxicity of any vitamin and mineral unless you're doing some really, really crazy dumb things. But for the most part, you're not seemingly getting a whole lot of extra performance because you're taking in more of one vitamin or the other, much less the minerals. So, yep, touched on this stuff a little bit before. Hooray! And Free radicals are things the body naturally produces through aerobic metabolism. These things effectively literally create things like hydrogen peroxide, and that can do damage inside of your cell. So you have what are known as antioxidants, and these are essentially molecules that are going to essentially pick up that free radical so we don't oxidize our tissues. So we've got a number of antioxidants of enzymes inside of our cells, along with a number of vitamins that are going to be important for doing this as well. Glutathione is one of the major ones you're going to find in the body when it comes to being an antioxidant. But then we've got a couple other, once again, molecules that are important here. Now, minerals, this is just an inorganic substance. So this is just literally an atom that has certain effects when it's incorporated into different types of enzymes or lattices in the body, hence calcium and phosphorus in your bones. And then phosphorus being also important in being phosphate. And now we're talking about ATP and the phospholipid bilayers inside of our cells. We've already talked about why calcium is important in calcium turnover. Iron obviously being incorporated into the heme group in both our hemoglobin and myoglobin, so as long as you get oxygen around the body. And it's also important in a number of different enzymatic processes. Too little, we become anemic. Too much, you're talking about iron overload. Good. Now, when we think about our electrolytes, it's not just going to be sodium, but also potassium and chloride. This is going to be what's really important for setting up that electrochemical gradient we have in our resting membranes. So we need to obviously have enough of it as a means so we can maintain all these balances. Too much can potentially lead to issues with high blood pressure, but too little will also cause issues with muscular contraction and overall feelings of wellness and potential fatigue. So now remember, guys, when it comes to our sodium, potassium, and chloride, we're going to lose all of those in our sweat. And on top of that, what's fascinating about sodium is we actually don't have a hormonal way to get rid of excess sodium. We do have a hormonal way to get rid of excess potassium. So for those of you guys that are really hard training athletes that are sweating a lot, you should be taking in more sodium. It will probably help you feel better, probably help you relax a little bit more at night and feel like it's a little bit easier to go to sleep. Whereas if you're talking about Homer Simpson that goes from one air-conditioned room to another air-conditioned room, never sweats, never really does much exercise. Well, now, since we don't have a way to get rid of excess sodium, hence why we can find ourselves in situations with high blood pressure. Now, we then have water. You should definitely drink a lot of it. It's really easy for athletes while they're sweating to lose anywhere from up to 6% of their body weight when we happen to be exercising in really warm environments. Obviously, we talked about the major effects of looking at that radiation, conduction, convection balance and how that can make things a bit more difficult. A lot of it is just intracellular, so inside the cellular bodies, but then obviously a third of it's going to be extracellular. And once we're getting over 10% of our body weight loss through water weight, acutely, now we're really risking myocardial infarction, other types of issues. So this is how we transport things around your body. This is how we're going to diffuse through cells. This is how we regulate our temperature. And notice, very importantly, our blood pressure. So not only is our hematocrit going up because we're dehydrating, but our blood pressure is having to go up because we're needing to keep more pressure on the lines so that we can allow that fluid to essentially be moving through like it should be. So most of our water that we're going to take in each day is in the form of beverages. Obviously, a certain amount of it is going to come from our food. And then a smaller amount from literally, remember, whenever we happen to go through aerobic metabolism, our net products is going to be carbon dioxide and water, hence cellular respiration. Now, food, things like fruits, vegetables are obviously much higher in water, water components than obviously desiccated things like jerky, much less when we're looking at things like nuts. Beverages obviously isn't just water. You can be drinking soda, irregardless of what people tell you. Some like light beer isn't really going to dehydrate you that much. Um, and then drinking soda, if you're dehydrated, also isn't going to really dehydrate you. It's just not going to hydrate you as quickly and as optimally. It's just water or water with a little bit of electrolytes. So yes, that's because of the sodium content that in turn is going to be effectively making you into a kind of a hypertonic situation. So you're wanting effectively water to address that issue. Same thing if you guys go real hard with, sodium on any type of food, do like really salty foods, and especially if you go really high carb, because of the glycogen increase is also going to require more water going into those cells. It's about, remember, 2.4 grams of water per every 1 gram of carbohydrate that we're storing as glycogen. So at rest, notice guys, most of it's being filtered out as urine. A certain amount is just natural evaporation off your skin and then in your breath when you're exhaling. And then a certain amount is going to be in your bowel movements. Too little, we're talking about constipation. Too high, we're talking about diarrhea. And then obviously sweating. Now, as we start to get into exercise itself, that's where we're going to see vast majority of our water loss is coming from straight up that sweating. Now, some of it obviously from the things we can't sense, mostly coming from literally our breathing. So like anything else, we're going to sweat more while we're exercising due to that higher body temperature. And our water loss is typically much greater than our water gain. So it's important to make sure that we're aware of effectively the sweating rate. That's why doing that pre-post body weight on our athletes can be a great way to figure out like, okay, are we losing a little bit too much, or are we doing a good job of effectively maintaining our body weight through practice, and then making sure that we're getting more in once we get done at about a 1.5 to 1 ratio. So 1.5x water we're drinking over how much water weight we've lost. As you'd expect, if you try and exercise dehydrated, your performance is going to be going down markedly because of that cardiovascular drift. So now because we have that lower plasma volume, our heart has to pump more times per minute. So our heart rate naturally needs to be higher. And if we do this for obviously longer and longer, performance is going to keep going down and down. Now, as far as its effect on anaerobic and strength performance, it is going to potentially decrease your performance just a little bit. Depends on, like anything else, the degree of dehydration, and this can literally show up in as little as a 1% of body weight loss through fluids. So when in doubt, drink more water. Obviously, that can be a little daunting for athletes that become pretty weight obsessed, and they're concerned about having their weight go up at all on the scale when it comes to obviously their water weight, and that's, it's tricky. So instead, just making sure that water is never being withheld, available, and obviously the athletes are being advised to drink anytime they're thirsty, and like anything else, that they're drinking consistently throughout the day, not just doing a massive bolus before they go out for practice or otherwise. So we touched on the electrolyte loss that we're going to have in sweat. Obviously, how much sodium and potassium we're losing is going to depend on how well trained we are. And like anything else, we need to make sure that we are replenishing what we lost. Now, notice another component here of sweat that's easy to forget is magnesium. Hence why making sure that we're getting in not just more sodium, potassium, and chloride, but a greater amount of magnesium. And back to Abby's question, in reality, doing a vegetarian diet, specifically a very plant-based diet, is typically very high in magnesium, because magnesium is actually part of what effectively is the light fixing group of the Calvin cycle in the chlorophyll of plants. So if you're eating a lot of green leafy vegetables, you're naturally getting in a pretty decent amount of magnesium every single day. But that is actually going to be the mineral that, statistically speaking, your average American is most likely to be deficient in. And vitamin D is going to be the vitamin that your average American is, statistically speaking, most likely to be too low in. So remember when we talked about endocrinology, as we happen to be losing more and more water, our body is going to be obviously decreasing our urine production. So we're not going to be excreting as much electrolytes through that manner. And remember, hormonally, this is going to be used by or done by aldosterone, and then also a little bit by the anti-diuretic hormone. So pretty much everything gets worse from your performance when you happen to be getting dehydrated. So not too hard to remember. Keeps it simple. Now, if you allow individuals to take in water while they're exercising, and the no saline is going to be water with obviously some sodium, it's going to allow folks to, now this is just insane because look at the exercise duration here, guys, 6 freaking hours. So we don't need to worry about dehydration all the time. Instead of, yeah, if we're going to exercise in very hot environments or we're dealing with very untrained individuals, we should be a little concerned. And then obviously, the further that duration is going to go, the greater the risk of these issues. Now, it's pretty rare you're ever going to have athletes that are exercising for 6 hours a day, but it's not unheard of when we're talking about 2-a-day training camps and otherwise. So we need to make sure that folks are drinking consistently while they happen to be performing their sport, and that they're going to be drinking consistently outside of the sport. So it's not just slamming down a half gallon of water right before weigh-ins, but taking it in consistently and well spaced enough that effectively they're going to be replenishing what they're losing without effectively over stressing their bodies. Yay. Now, a pretty rare event is what's known as hyponatremia. This is going to be where individuals are taking in a lot of water, but not enough sodium. And they're going to be losing that sodium through sweat. So what'll happen is now, since our sodium levels are too low, our electrochemical gradients are not what they should be. And we can literally risk people dying from it. It seems to happen very rarely, but when it does, it's actually typically people that are like marathoners, people doing an Ironman or an ultra marathon. So they're going out for incredibly long periods of time. They are rehydrating, but they're rehydrating with just water or like distilled water. So there is no mineral content. And because of this, they're going to run the risk of their electrolytes being absolutely too low. Now, am I worried about the cross-country girls going out for a long run and finding themselves into effectively hyponatremia? No. But if someone's going to, yeah, no worries. So when we talk about, it's when you think about it, you see excessive rehydration or just overhydration, remember we naturally have those electrolyte levels inside of our cells. Now, as we're exercising, we're going to keep sweating it out. But the nice thing is we're losing water at about the same rate we're losing electrolytes. And so we're never going to have really weird issues going on with electrolyte levels inside of our body. Now, what'll happen if we happen to be sweating out a lot and replenishing just plain water, but no electrolytes to go with it? Well, we're diluting our body's natural electrolyte levels. And if they get to be too dilute, what happens is our natural electrical chemical gradients essentially that's interesting. We'll get there in a second. What happens is they're going to become so effectively hyponatremic because they're so diluted. Now their electrical chemical gradients aren't working like they're supposed to, hence why we've got issues with osmolarity, hence the bloating and puffiness. They're going to be nauseous, headaches, vomiting, because their electrolyte levels are so far off. And it goes too far off, literally, their heart isn't going to work like it's supposed to, and their brain no think good, and they can literally potentially die from it. Foaming at the mouth is pretty damn interesting. That sounds not necessarily like a whole lot of fluid. That almost sounds more like its electrolytes function of causing excess viscosity of the saliva. That's interesting. Sure, she didn't just like pop something that was effervescent in her mouth so she'd foam at the mouth and scare you. But no, in reality, that's very odd. Oh, that's not smart. Yeah, that could do it. That could do it. And she was almost acutely driving herself into something that will, yeah, get along those lines. Yeah, don't do that. Don't do that, kids. So, and that, yeah, that'll do it to you. Yes, because you are getting to be dehydrated. And you have to think about the natural effect of all the breathing you're doing, specifically, no offense, when you're really tired and you're exhausted at the end, you're doing a lot of mouth breathing. So you're naturally drying out your mouth on top of that. So because of that, you're going to be obviously not the normal level of, yes, effective fluid that you should have, or osmolarity that you should have of the fluid inside of your mouth. So there's nothing wrong with, obviously, once again, the vegetarian diet. We talk about vegan, obviously that's only using things that come from plants and not even being comfortable with things like honey. Lacto, meaning they'll only steal the lactations of female mammals. Lacto-ovo, meaning they'll steal the lactations of essentially permanently kept pregnant women of other species, along with steal their unfertilized eggs. And devour them as a flex to showing that we can incarcerate your species, but keep you alive because it entertains us and allows us to make things like quiche and cheese. I don't know. But keeping in mind, we can have issues potentially more so with the vitamins and minerals. Total calories is rarely an issue, especially these days with how many different options you have. Because let's face it, if you're doing lacto-ovo vegetarian, you've got access to dairy. You do whole milk, you do ice cream, we're not going to have an issue with getting enough calories. Now, if you're going vegan, well, as long as you're still allowing yourself to eat things like nuts that are pretty calorically dense, you shouldn't really have an issue either there. The bigger issues come into, once again, potential issues of not getting enough. Now, pre-competition meals, we talked about kind of in pieces before, but let's give you the main takeaways. We want to make sure that it's about 200, 500 calories at least 2 hours before that competition. So it's not going to feel heavy on you. It's not going to negatively affect your performance. Mostly want to stick with things that are carbohydrate based, and obviously liquid diets are going to be far more easily digest than more solid diets. The big thing is if you're working with an athlete, and specifically you're working with their nutrition before their competitions, is we want to effectively homogenize as much as possible. So we want to practice our race day eating as much as we can. Obviously, let's pick on them because it's easy and they're here. But when you're talking about the cross-country athletes, when you guys compete, you're pretty much always going on the road. You're never really doing a home meet. So you're waking up usually where? On a bus. So Colleen obviously passed out on a bus. Probably the rest of her teammates are going to wake up in a hotel. Now, when you wake up in that hotel, a lot of those hotels are going to have breakfast. And it's relatively, I'm not here to judge, relatively homogenized. That you're going to have like a couple cereal options. You'll probably have like yogurt, maybe some mediocre oatmeal. So, well, first and foremost, you can always pack ahead. If, let's say, for example, Abby finds that like 3 packets of strawberries and cream oatmeal from Quaker is, she feels good. It doesn't feel heavy on her. It doesn't give her any GI upset. And that's like her breakfast. Easy. She can pack that. She can probably find hot water every time she goes, and she's going to be able to get after it. Now, oh, well, that's disappointing. So the key is, like anything else, we want to find what's that pre-race meal that seems to sit the best on their stomach, doesn't give them any types of issues, not making them, having used the bathroom at inopportune times, and once again, not causing any bloating, any type of indigestion. And then from there, hey, if it's what works and it works consistently, then by all means, go ahead and stay with it. If instead, you're having GI cramping, you're having bowel movements or massive desire to have a bowel movement during the race, anything that's going to be taking away from your performance, that's where we want to effectively play around a little bit. And the nice thing is, oatmeal is highly portable, cereal is highly portable. You've got a number of different options that you can just think tactically about effectively what's going to work well for your athlete. Some folks can probably have a full meal. Definitely when you're on the road for a competition, irregardless if you're a competing athlete or otherwise, good. Measure it out in the future so you can exactly try to figure out your dosages, your intake there, Abby, as a way to optimize that so you know your food choices. Now let's figure out how much of each of those you can do if you aren't doing that already. But now is not the time to get exotic. Now is not the time to try a bunch of different foods and otherwise that you haven't tried before. Now is the time to keep it simple, eat the things that your body is used to, and be able to easily digest and allow you to perform well. So you can try, maybe some more interesting local foods after your competition if you traveled. But if you're there to compete first, then worry about trying the neat local restaurants. Because if you're going to have food poisoning or otherwise, it's better to do it after you compete than before. So if we've got a higher amount of glycogen in any sport that obviously is requiring us to use it, we're typically going to perform much better. So there's a number of different ways that we can try to load glycogen. So we're going to maximize those glycogen stores. One of which is to effectively do a normal diet and then go super high carbohydrate. And we're talking about could be 80% of your total calories every day coming from carbohydrates. It's just absolutely massive. And this is a great strategy for people that happen to be doing things like running marathons. Now, if you're an average athlete, we probably don't need to do anything like this. This is two different approaches because we have the aspirin, which is absolutely awful, which is you do a relatively low carbohydrate diet and effectively try to fatigue out your muscle or do fatiguing workouts and then max out your glycogen levels. Or you can do more of a mixed, easier approach where then you're going to go still high carbohydrate, but you're going to taper back your work. Now, this one's going to be the best method to do if you're trying to essentially cut weight before a competition. So this is actually this is the type of approach that I would use for things like a lifting competition as an easy way to lose, easily could be 10 plus pounds for somebody my size because of glycogen depletion. Whereas if you're trying to work with anybody else, this is going to be the much kinder, gentler approach to use it, because if we double up those glycogen stores, it doesn't really help so much with strength and power. It improves your leverages a little bit and helps you feel a bit safer in the bottom. But especially for a marathoner, congratulations, you're going to be hitting the wall much later on if you're going to be hitting it at all. So, like anything else, we want to make sure that we're loading appropriately with our carbohydrates over time, understanding that when we get done with our competitions, that's when our glycogen synthesis rates are going to be the highest, but our glycogen levels are going to be the lowest. Hence why it's so important to make sure that we're restoring these levels as quickly as we can. And like anything else, we can resynthesize our liver glycogen pretty quickly. In fact, we tend to be empty in the morning and then breakfast tends to bring us back. But our muscle glycogen can take anywhere from, well, you can see in this example here, we're almost talking about a full week before the levels are going to fully come back in individuals that competed in a marathon. So don't be afraid to go high carbohydrate, especially when it's appropriate for the type of athlete you're working with. And post-workout, doing well. And here's just some basic guidelines of what you want to work with whenever you're doing work with individuals that happen to be utilizing sport drinks. Really, so we're talking about water, a little bit of carbs, and some electrolytes. It's going to help your performance in just about anything that's an actual sport you care about. If we're talking about Homer Simpson walking on a treadmill or playing pickup basketball, don't waste your money. Just drink water. If your goal is obviously to be a competing athlete, okay, that's where we can look into doing this a little bit more. Making sure that we don't put in too much carbohydrates, because if it's too much, it empties a lot slower and we're more likely to potentially have some issues with that digestion and breakdown. Sodium is going to be important, not just for electrolyte levels, but it also works in the symporter of getting glycogen in or glucose into your bloodstream. And the heavier the flavor and like aftertaste, the less likely it is to be enjoyed. So you have to figure out what you'd like. If you guys want a simple solution, just get some water and or just buy some Gatorade and then water it down. It's like a 1-to-1 ratio. And that's going to definitely allow you to get yourself where you need to be. So I'm sorry, gone over, no class Friday. What other questions, comments, concerns you guys have for me? And otherwise, you guys can be done. We're going to have, it's kind of intertwined in a number of different, but it's going to be definitely a component of the first chapter. It's going to be a component of chapter 3 with the neurological as well. And then a little bit into the training chapter. So it's going to touch a little bit on 9, 10, and then I think 11 and 12. Thank you guys for obviously giving me feedback as we're going through and letting me know when we needed to change up our speed so that you guys would be able to obviously pick up what I'm putting down. Take care of yourselves, stay safe out there, and I will see you guys back on Monday, and we're going to talk about drugs, and I will try to keep my profanity down to less than 10 times in that hour, but hopefully it'll be a good time. And then after that, we're going to talk a little about being old and young and how that changes training. So stay safe out there, guys, and have a great day. So bye. You too, Lincoln.